Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei-Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Aloha and good morning. Thanks so much for starting your week off with us. I'm Ryan Kalei-Suji, joined by Yanji Denise, and this is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Great to see so many of you already tuning in here this morning as we catch up with a guest who we always are able to cover a lot of topics with.
So much to talk about with our guest this morning. Joining us from his office in Washington, D.C. is Senator Brian Schatz. Senator, thank you for being here.
My pleasure to see both of you.
Always good to see you. I want to start with the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got a lot to get to, but first and foremost, we'd love to know your thoughts on, the passage of that act and also how you think it's going to impact Hawaii in the years to come.
Well, first of all, it's the most important and largest climate action that any country has ever taken. We have a national goal of getting to a 50% reduction in emissions by the year 2030, and this gets us 40% reduction. So it's 80% towards our goal, and that's a relatively conservative estimate. So for the very first time in history, we can say with a straight face that the federal government is taking meaningful climate action that is sort of equal to the task. It's really the reason that I wanted to enter the Senate 10 years ago. And so we've got lots more work to do, but I have to say I was relieved and happy and surprised and thrilled. The other piece of it that I think is really important for people in Hawaii is that it's going to reduce the cost of prescription medicine for those people in Hawaii on Medicare. For the first time, the very first time, the federal government will have the authority under Medicare to negotiate the price of prescription medicine for those on Medicare, and it establishes an annual cap on how much a person on Medicare can pay. So it's really going to save a lot of people a lot of money. And the way we generate the revenue in order to pay for the climate piece, the prescription drug piece actually pays for itself, but the climate piece is paid for by establishing a minimum corporate tax of 15%, because there were several billion-dollar corporations that paid zero, or in some cases even less than zero. And this establishes that no American corporation can pay anything less than the 50% minimum.
And when it comes to, again, some of the climate pieces of this act, how do you think Hawaii residents will be able to see some of the changes, whether it be through legislation that may be directly impacting them, or something that may come down from a national level, or maybe policies that have to be changed on the local level to be able to adjust to some of the things that have been passed through?
Well, at the consumer level, the most exciting piece is that if you want to get a solar photovoltaic system in the state of Hawaii, the average price is around $16,000 retail. Now that can be way bigger or way smaller depending on the size of your house and what your electricity needs are. But take $16,000. The current state credit is 35%. The federal credit will be 30%. And so if you add it all up, it's something. The math gets a little funky, but think of it like you're going to save 2/3. So a $16,000 solar system for your roof will cost $5,000, maybe $6,000. So lots of consumers are going to be able to get a solar roof that currently are unable to. The other piece is conservation, hot water heating, all of the rest of it. There's a 30% subsidy so that everyone can invest in conservation. Everybody understands that over the long run, you save money when you conserve energy, but that doesn't mean people have the upfront cost. And this bill specifically was designed to make sure that people, regular people, citizens, homeowners, renters are able to take part in the clean energy revolution. And then at the kind of macro level, we all know we have a 100% clean energy statutory goal in the state of Hawaii. And in order to get that to be realistic, we need the production tax credit and the investment tax credit for solar and wind. That's the kind of industrial scale solar and wind farms. And that was extended for a full 10 years. And that's really doing the bulk of the work in terms of emissions reduction. So at the big picture level, it helps us to meet our state's clean energy goals. but at the individual household level, it helps people to save on their utility bills.
I want to ask you another piece, of course, of environmental issue that is very important to you and is important to everyone in the state of Hawaii is Red Hill. I'd love to know your thoughts on, since you were last on, the Navy did release their timeline, which is quite lengthy and unacceptable according to the Department of Health. What did you make of that timeline of draining the tanks in about 2.5 years? What are you hoping to see in the Navy's new follow-up now that the Department of Health has rejected that plan?
I agree with the Department of Health. That is an unacceptable timeline. It is the Department of Defense. When they want to get something done quickly, expeditiously, they can get it done. We don't want to be unreasonable here and cause them to move forward without a plan. But 2.5 years is an unreasonable time frame. On September 7th, they're supposed to submit their plan to the Department of Health, and that'll help me in the appropriations process. We already got $250 million for defueling and shutting down the facility. And then the president put $1 billion additional in the president's budget. But in order for us to get money in the next appropriations bill, there needs to be a plan. It's very difficult to fund something that is just a notion. And this plan is really critical for me getting the resources into the next defense appropriations markup over the next month or two. The other thing that I think is maybe the most important thing in the next month or so is that Secretary Austin wants to establish a JTF, a Joint Task Force, with a 3-star admiral in charge of defueling and decommissioning and shutting down Red Hill. And let's be really clear about what that means. This person's only job would be Red Hill. And I think part of the challenge, we had Aquilino and we had Paparo, and I think they did a reasonable job under really difficult circumstances. But their job is to be prepared for war. Their job is to be looking out into the Pacific theater and seeing whether we are ready and getting ready for something bad to happen in the region. The Spratly Islands, the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, whatever it may be, they have to have their eyeballs on our own readiness from a military standpoint. And to ask them to do that, which is their primary job, and to oversee a very complicated, very expensive public works project, frankly, without the expertise to do so, is not reasonable. So this new person's job will be to oversee the decommissioning, the defueling, and the shutting down of Red Hill, and importantly, the remediation afterwards, because getting the fuel out is important, but we also have to make people whole and make the environment whole. And so, as much as I would like to say we're going to be done with this in the next year or two when they defuel, we also have to understand there were human impacts and environmental impacts that may extend beyond the period of defueling that we also have to track. So I'm very anxious to get them to actually appoint this 3-star and get on with it.
I want to circle back to the funding piece that you spoke of and just the funding mechanisms that are going to be required in order to do this process. Do you foresee any challenges in the future should the Defense Department or other portions of the military say they need more funding in order to carry out this defueling, knowing that there could be some changes in the makeup of the Senate and the House and how the body of the entire Congress could change? Do you see that there could be any potential holdups on the financing of the defueling of this in the future?
Well, only the paranoid survive in my business. And so I worry about that all the time. I will say I don't see anything in particular to worry about right now, but I certainly view political risk and fiscal risk as real. If the Department of Defense changes hands, if there's a new commander in chief, if the Congress changes hands, all of those things could impact things. Right now, we have really good bipartisan support for the new concept of operations in the theater. And I think that's the work that we did on the Defense Committee, along with Maisie and Ed and Kai, to kind of make sure that this wasn't just a response to an environmental crisis, which it was, but also a better, more environmentally sound, more ready way to actually deal with fuel in the Pacific theater. We started to realize that Paparo and Aquilino believe that it actually makes no sense from a readiness standpoint to keep most of our fuel for the fleet above IAEA, and that we should have it all throughout the region. And so because they were able to make this national security case for this new concept of operations, I think it's significantly more insulated from politics. But, I'm in the business of politics, so I will continue to be vigilant about those possibilities. Ryan, you sound like one of my best staffers.
I'm interested to know, going back to the leadership position that you outlined there, how soon do you expect that person to be appointed, and what's the process? Does that appointment just happen? Does it need any kind of approval? I mean, what are the sort of next steps on that?
Secretary of Defense just has to do it. We're hearing, and it's just really chatter, but we're hearing that it's coming shortly. In federal government terms, shortly does not usually mean a day or two. It usually means weeks. But I don't think we're talking about many months before the JTF is stood up and that there's leadership there. They're also anxious to make sure that one person is in charge of this Red Hill project, because it takes the burden of managing Red Hill again while being ready to, as they say, fight tonight, off of Indo-PACOM. There really needs to be one person who wakes up every morning and thinks about Red Hill and Red Hill only in the Department of Defense. And to be clear, shutting down Red Hill and shutting down Red Hill only. They are not going to be given discretion to reconsider the decision that was already made by the Secretary of Defense. That decision has been made. This person's job will be to execute it.
Another topic that has made headlines over the last week has been President Biden's announcement of cancellation of or payback of student debt for college students. Wanted to get your thoughts. This is something that has drawn both praise and criticism from both sides. Your thoughts on the president's announcement and this plan moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I think the context here, right, is that lots of people remember going to college and remember paying off their student loans. And so there's some people that are a little bit grouchy, like, I paid off my student loans, why can't these people? Well, the truth is that the student debt burden is way, way, way worse than it used to be. And that's just a fact. The cost of college, the rising inflation in higher education is well outpacing even healthcare costs. And student debt is now more than credit card debt and second only to mortgage debt in terms of the burden it places on this younger generation. And so lots of people I know personally still struggle with student loans. And I think this is going to be very, very helpful to lots of people that I know that are just trying to get their life started. And they start out, with a degree, or even sometimes not even having finished, but they're just buried by it all. And so I think it's a good move. And I think it's going to allow people to move forward.
I'm interested to know sort of a litmus of how we are doing as a state, the kind of calls that your office is getting. I always like to ask you this question because it reflects really the concerns of our community. When unemployment checks were going out and they weren't going out on time, I know you were getting a lot of that, a lot of COVID calls. What kind of concerns are you hearing from constituents right now from our state?
It is now not COVID specific. People want to know what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. And how they can benefit from it. But it has gone to the sort of more baseline concerns, which are VA, Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act. So it's like the baseline of stuff that everybody is worried about in terms of their interactions with the federal government. I would say we're at a sort of unique period over the last 2 months where it's not a policy issue that people are calling our office with, but more likely just hey, I need help with the federal government. I'm not sure who to call. I know that Schatz is my senator. Maybe he can point me in the right direction. So we're in a unique period where it's not one particular thing, but just a sort of general, can you help me with the federal government?
I want to circle back on what we started this conversation off with the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically with climate. You had mentioned that this is a small piece of a much larger goal of things that you would like to see done. What do you think is the next steps beyond what has just already passed? Down the line, what would you like to see also included in other versions of this for the second part of response to climate change as we continue to see how this is impacting us here in Hawaii?
A couple things. First, I think on the federal level, we have to execute, and we kind of learned this when we established the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, right? We set these very lofty goals, but whether or not we actually met our goals in any given year depended on whether a specific project, wherever it was, actually got plugged into the grid. And so if you think of that at a national and international level, you really have to execute. You're going to need massive solar farms and wind farms and hydroelectrical projects and geothermal projects. And some of that is going to require that the federal processes for permitting get a little bit more streamlined. So I'm really focused on enabling these projects to get executed. And then the other part of this is that, even though the United States is probably tied with China at this point, depending on how you count it, as the largest emitter, you're still not going to make the global difference that you need to unless you have global cooperation. And so for the first time in probably 6 years, we have the ability to go back into the international community and advocate for other countries to take bolder and bigger climate action. I'm now on the Foreign Relations Committee, and we're going to try as best we can to kind of use our new renewed credibility in the climate space. I'm working with former Secretary Kerry to try to get other countries to move as fast as they can. And so those are two pieces. And then at the technical level, there's some technical issues with the electric vehicle tax credit that we simply have to fix.
I'm interested. I know you're in your office, so you can't necessarily campaign since that's not allowed, but I am interested to get your thoughts on the August 13th primary here in Hawaii. The makeup of the delegation, Republican or Democrat, depending on how voters choose in November, will change, and that will affect your work as well. So just interested to get your thoughts on that election.
Well, I mean, let's just talk about the delegation. It was, I'm now 10 years in the United States Senate. I almost can't believe it when I say it. But this last Congress was I think the highest functioning group that we've had, the four of us, myself and Maisie and Ed and Kai. And I am really confident that Jill Tokuda will be able to fit right in as a member of a four-person team. She understands teamwork. And I think there's a recognition from all of us, all four of us. Doesn't mean we always agree, but from all four of us, that we're only as strong as we are unified. And so that's going to be my focus. I'll also observe that, and again, I don't want to talk too much about electoral politics, but I will observe that those people who were attacked the most emerged victorious. And I think that was a good lesson for everybody across the state. And I didn't have a rooting interest, particularly with any of the primary elections, because my role is to get along with whomever emerges. But I have to tell you, I was glad to see that the negative attacks did not work, because once they start working, then we're in a different world in the state of Hawaii in terms of electoral politics.
I want to also just switch gears to talk a little bit about the politics that's happening in Washington, D.C. There seems to continue to be just a divide between both parties and a constant battle, if you will, between those who support the former president Donald Trump, as well as those who argue that it's time to move on. And obviously, there is a lot of things that are currently still being investigated with the January 6th hearings. I wanted to get your take on where we are with that, specifically with the January 6th committee, what they've revealed through these hearings, and what you hearing that we can expect to see coming up in September when they are set to resume those hearings once again.
Well, I think they've done extraordinary bipartisan work, and it's one of the more solemn obligations that you could possibly have as a member of Congress to investigate, to oversee, to inquire into an insurrection, an attempt to overthrow American democracy itself. And so, I watch the hearings when I can. Sometimes I'm in my own hearings. Sometimes I'm conducting my own hearings, but I read the summaries, and I just think they've been very serious-minded. I think they have tried to eschew partisan politics to the extent that it's possible, and they have uncovered facts and fact patterns that ought to alarm every patriotic American. So I'm pleased with their work. But Ryan, I do want to just make sure your viewers understand that even though we are fighting about some pretty important issues like democracy itself, like climate, like reproductive choice, we still had a really successful Congress in terms of bipartisan action. The first gun safety legislation in more than a generation, a massive bill to help veterans who have had toxic exposure, especially to burn pits. We passed the CHIPS Act, which helps us to sort of inshore our domestic manufacturing capacity on microchips and straighten out our supply chains. We've done some really important work on a bipartisan basis. And I think that's, part of the job, right, is to be able to fight on a partisan basis when necessary, but to wake up the next morning and go and collaborate with the same person that you were yelling at. And if you're not capable of doing that, it's probably not the right job for you. But I just did want everyone to understand that even though we're fighting about a bunch of important things, and I feel very strongly about those things, we've also been able to deliver some pretty big bipartisan wins.
I wanted to bring in a viewer question, and it relates to something that you said earlier, which is that the constituent calls that you're getting have largely not been focused on COVID. One of the things the governor has sort of sounded the alarm on for the population here is that a lot of those COVID funds are running out, and so things like vaccines and testing and treatments will have to be funded through insurance or private means. Ingrid says, will Congress fund more COVID safety, vaccine, treatment, outreach, et cetera? Do you have any concerns now that that federal money is going away about what will happen when it comes to, preventing more spread in our community?
Yeah, I do worry about that. I don't think that's a 2-week issue. I think that's a 2-month issue. We're very hopeful that we're going to have some COVID specific. And when we talk about COVID money, we have to remember that 2 years ago, it was about stabilizing the entire economy, right? Paying a hardware store to keep everybody employed while keeping everybody home. That's not what we're talking about anymore. Now we're talking about, specific money for healthcare, for addressing this particular pandemic. So therefore, it's a smaller amount of money. And we're hopeful that that will be passed on the next appropriations bill, which we are hopeful to pass by the end of the fiscal year this fall. So yes, it's a concern. It's not an absolutely immediate concern, but it is less money, and there is bipartisan support for a narrower COVID response bill, not a COVID relief bill, but a COVID response bill for vaccines and anything else that needs to be done in terms of the public health space.
Another topic and concern that we've covered on this program has been the labor shortage here in the islands. And really, it's an issue that is not confined to Hawaii. We've seen states across the country who are struggling to find workers for skilled positions, as well as just in the service industry as well. And many local businesses have been suffering and struggling to find people to fill those roles. Do you think that there's anything that can be done on the federal level to help to address some of these concerns about labor issues? And how do you think we ended up at this point as we come out of this pandemic?
Well, I guess let me give you two thoughts, Ryan. It's a good question. The first is that I don't think there's any legislation you could pass in time to address the labor shortage right now, because people have their ads out and they're unable to hire, and us passing a law, at best would take a couple of years to be implemented enough to make structural changes in the workforce. We do have a Workforce Development Act that we pass every 2 to 4 years, and there are some smart reforms that we can make, but that's not going to make a difference for someone who immediately needs someone. And so, my own view is that I think we ought to be careful about telling everybody that we can solve their problems through a new federal law. And this is not one that I think we can fix through a federal law. And I also think that part of what's happening is we shut down the entire economy, or most of the private sector economy, and then it started back up again. And you're going to have a kind of inefficiency in those markets that has to kind of work itself out. It's just like the supply chain problem, the shipping problem, our chips challenges. Those are all functions of, we've never really shut down the American economy and then started it right back up. And it's rather clunky. I'm not trying to excuse or diminish the seriousness of this problem. It's just that I think it's responsible for me to tell you what I think I can fix and what I think I can't fix.
Building on Ryan's question about January 6th, I'm interested to know what you thought about the investigation at Mar-a-Lago, the documents that were taken, and what we've learned. There's still so many unanswered questions because so much of the information that's released has been redacted. But overall, just your impressions on what's happening with that investigation at the president's residence.
Well, a couple of thoughts. First, the Attorney General is a very, very careful nonpartisan guy, not a bipartisan guy, a nonpartisan guy. And so it is very hard to imagine that he would have done anything other than the most small c conservative, cautious thing here for the Department of Justice, for his own way of doing things. And so I don't think he took lightly any of the actions that the Department of Justice took. And I think he made it really clear that he authorized them himself. And so that gives me reason to believe that this is serious stuff. I don't know any more than anyone else as to what specifically may or may not have transpired and what federal statutes may or may not have been violated. I will say this, though. There is an emerging theory of the case that not just the current presidents, but that former presidents have some sort of immunity under their presidential powers. Now, during the impeachment trial, I was one of the loudest in pushing back on this idea that a president can break the law as long as it's in the process of discharging the president's duties. I always thought that was kind of goofy, but I'll admit that, half the Congress believes that presidents have specific protections against being tried for statutory crimes. Fine. Former presidents have no protections in statutory law, in constitutional law, in rule, in practice. And so if the former president violated any federal law, he needs to be treated just like the rest of us. And I don't know what has or has not been violated, but my own view is that nobody is above the law, and that includes former presidents.
We only have a few more minutes here, but just wanted to ask you in closing, just some of the things that you're working on here in the next few months as we close out the year. What are some of the key elements and things that you are looking to maybe accomplish as you wind down 2022?
So I'm really focused on appropriations because I'm the chairman of the Transportation and Housing and Urban Development Subcommittee on Approach, which means I get to essentially make the budgets for the Department of Transportation and HUD. We've got a good proposal. It's called a MARC, in other words, a draft of a bill that we'd like to make law. But we need Republicans in the Senate, Republicans in the House, and Democrats in the House to agree with the president and enact this law. That bill will be tremendously helpful for the state of Hawaii. And it's the first order of business, really, when it comes to us coming back to work in the month of September. And then my guess is, frankly, for the month of October, most people will be back in their home states campaigning and making sure that everybody's visible for the election. And then we come back in November and we've got a defense bill. And I'd really like to fix to make some tweaks to the Inflation Reduction Act on the clean energy side. But my singular focus over the next 6 weeks is going to be making sure that I deliver on federal funds for the state of Hawaii.
I think Doris sums it up for us perfectly here. I always learn something when I listen to Senator Schatz. We learned a lot from you this morning. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks to you both. I appreciate it.
Aloha.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground. If you missed any part of this conversation, you can always watch from the beginning after we log off. You can catch it on KKAI, that's channel 50, a rebroadcast for the next few days, or catch us as a podcast later this afternoon. Ryan, I thought it was very interesting to hear the developments on Red Hill, the idea that a 3-star will be nominated or appointed rather, whose sole focus will just be to manage Red Hill. That's something that the senator says he thinks is very necessary, and I think it's something that we here in Hawaii would very much welcome.
Yeah, but you also heard him echoing his concerns about the timeline that has been presented, saying the 2 years is too long, knowing that there needs to be more action done, and believing that this appointed position will help to expedite and hopefully move this process along a lot quicker. Also talking about the importance of the federal funding and the report that will be coming out in just a few days that will allow him the opportunity to really make a case for any other additional funds that are needed. But him saying that he continues to keep an eye on this issue, recognizing that it is important and that there needs to be a continuous conversation, as well as holding the military accountable for some of these actions and making sure that this is done as quickly and as safely as possible. We also heard from him on a variety of topics, as you discussed, Yanju. We covered a lot of different ground, but also hearing about the Inflation Reduction Act, the impact that it will directly have for Hawaii consumers on the medical standpoint, as well as on the climate side as well, but also noting that there are other things that he would like to change, including some technical issues to some of the language that was included on the climate side with regards to electrical vehicles, but saying that this landmark piece of legislation that has passed will really impact not only this current generation, but future generations, and hoping to do more during his time in Congress.
Absolutely. And also saying that it really changes the dynamic on the world stage, that now that the United States has made this commitment, it allows us then to have more ground to stand on when negotiating with other countries and trying to make sure that they are making their own progress when it comes to this issue. Interesting to hear his thoughts on COVID. He did say that they are hoping to get some COVID. I'm trying to think of the distinction that he made, but basically saying it's not necessarily financial relief. It's very much targeting public health dollars so that tests and vaccines and other public health measures can be covered when it comes to COVID, that the dynamic has changed when it comes to battling the pandemic, and they want to be very targeted in the money that they allocate in that direction. Also interested to get his thoughts on the Student Loan Act. The Biden administration announcing that they want to give relief to a number of people who owe money to on their student loans, and why he supports that very wholeheartedly, and also his thoughts on the January 6th hearings and the investigation at Mar-a-Lago. So we cover a lot of ground with him. The Red Hill portion was very, very interesting. Someone else who is no doubt will find that interesting is Ernie Lau. He's our guest on Friday, but on Wednesday, we're going to be focusing on the economy with Professor Carl Bonham.
Yeah, we're going to address some of the concerns of inflation, as well as just getting his thoughts on what's happening with the labor shortages here in Hawaii. We talked a little bit about that as well with Senator Schatz, but some of the other economic issues that are happening here in the state, and projections looking forward, what we can expect as we move into 2023, and his thoughts on the state of Hawaii's economy. Always good to get some insights from Carl Bonham there from the University of Hawaii program. So looking forward to those conversations. We hope you'll join us right back here on Wednesday for another episode of Spotlight Hawaii. Aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.